Welcome to Avenue M. My name is Joey Taylor.
And I'm Haroon Mogul.
We're two men on a journey of faith and meaning. In each episode, we sit down with a remarkable guest to unpack the moments that shape us, the struggles that build us, and the questions that intrigue us. Today's guest is Shadi Hamid, our first ever return guest. He's a columnist at the Washington Post, senior fellow at Georgetown University Center for Muslim Christian Understanding, and one of Prospect Magazine's top 50 thinkers in the world. His newest book, The Case for American Power, argues that America, for all of its contradictions and failures, is still, in his words, the last best hope for a more moral and just world. In this conversation, we press him on that claim. Is it possible for a nation-state to act morally? What happens when faith traditions rooted in humility and sacrifice collide with the logic of power? And what do we do when moral conviction itself becomes a weapon? In foreign policy, in Gaza, and even in our domestic politics. Shadi calls his book a love letter to America, but the conversation quickly becomes a debate about what love looks like and what it demands when the country you love commits moral wrongs. It's a conversation about belief and realism, religion and responsibility, power and purity, and whether the only way to redeem power is to take it.
So we are really excited to welcome Shadi back. He's got a book coming out in, by the time this is released, probably about a week or so. November 11th, is that correct?
That's right. Yeah.
Awesome. So to start, the easy question, The Case for American Power. Tell us about the book.
Oh, okay.
Just jumping right in.
So I kind of see this book as a love letter to America despite its faults. And it's a case for believing in America and fighting for it, especially now, because I think we need that. I see so many people around me losing faith. And there was just a remarkable polling result. And I always have to check on this to make sure it's real, because it's like mind-boggling. But in the early 2000s, about 90% of Democrats were either extremely or very proud to be American. In 2025, that number had dropped to 36%. So we are seeing, it's remarkable. And it's not a surprise to me that that's the case, because I talk to my millennial or even Gen Z friends and acquaintances, and the idea of loving America is passé. If you're a liberal, if you're anti-Trump, if you're left of center, the idea that you could love a country, it just gives people the ick, I guess. So I felt that that has to be rebutted. And those ideas of kind of self-loathing and even self-hatred have to be fought against. Because I don't want those people to exit the political game. Because if they cede the ground to people who don't have a moral sensibility, if they cede the ground to people who love power, and those people tend to be sociopaths, then we're in a difficult situation. So I want people to regain their love and appreciation for America, and then they can act, I think, in better ways. They can involve themselves in the country's future in a way that maybe they weren't willing to before.
Damn, Shadi, you're good at this, because I had all these critical questions prepared, and then your opening statement made me feel like, wow, I totally agree with him. So
wow.
I don't. I disagree with him.
Do you?
Yeah. Well, no, I don't. I don't at all. I think one of the things that's important here, though, is for you to share what the specific thesis of the book is. I think that's where it starts to get a little contentious.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Yeah. So, I mean, let me read one thing that you wrote, and then I would love to hear your riff on it a little bit. This book is about believing America is still the last best hope for a more moral and just world.
Yes, so I said that.
So let me hear you. I mean, that's the contentious claim that you're making, I think, right? I think both Haroon and I, I'm assuming, would be comfortable with more patriotism, with more pride for our country. But framed in that way, it starts to get a little uncomfortable for me. So
can you say more about what makes you feel uncomfortable?
I think there's a couple of levels to it. I would say number one, it's hard for me to imagine that a nation state, that its primary kind of operating system is based in a moral consciousness, and it's not based in self-interest. So that's the first level. The second level is, I think, just a discomfort with an orientation towards power. And I think, I was trained as a community organizer, and one of the first things that they talk about in community organizing training, kind of coming from a Saul Alinsky model, is they're trying to break down people's discomfort with power, and they're trying to say, actually, power is a thing that exists, and it can be a force for good in the world. But I think that orientation to power is a little challenging for me, especially as a person of faith, who is trying to live out ideals like the meek will inherit the earth and let's love our enemies and that kind of stuff. So I think there's a couple of different registers that I feel a little uncomfortable with the claim.
Well, I guess Harun and I don't believe in loving our enemies.
Yeah, it's true.
I feel like there's a lot of assumptions being made about Harun right now. And Harun's going to let Shadi answer, and then...
Yeah, sure. We're just messing around. Okay. Look, I think that the question of self-interest versus morality is an important one. And let's not pretend here, America is not an NGO. It's not a human rights organization. That's not its primary focus. If you are, whether we like it or not, if you're a leader or politician who's in a senior position in government, in national security, let's say, your job is to make sure that American citizens are safe. American citizens are in some sense more valued than non-citizens. By definition, that's what the nation state allows for and enables. So there's no way to get around the fact that there's going to be an impetus towards self-preservation and self-interest. Now, we also have a moral mission, and every single president up until Donald Trump expressed some version of that moral mission, that America is not just a traditional nation state. It is a nation that aspires to something more. Now, whether or not we actually meet those aspirations is a different story. Here, I'm just saying that we have them. And the pretense matters. And I have a chapter on hypocrisy. We can maybe talk about that in a bit. That sometimes hypocrisy is just the cost of doing business in the world. But there are times when our naked self-interest can actually meet with our moral purpose. And that's great. If the two come together, we should embrace that. Granted, oftentimes when our perceived self-interest is in tension with our moral purpose, we choose the self-interest. That happens a lot, obviously. I want that to change. I want us to see our moral and national interest as being more closely intertwined, that you can't really have one without the other, because the source of American strength is our moral distinctiveness. And here I'm talking about the fact that we are a democracy, however flawed. And that makes us, in my view, morally superior to countries like China and Russia. And I'm saying morally superior on purpose, because I know that will put people off, but it is really what I believe. And I think we should be comfortable saying things like that. The second point on discomfort with power, well, that's what I'm trying to push back against, because I worry that people of faith, people who are good, people who are on the left, they want to be morally pure. They don't want to taint themselves. And I remember this because I was part of that scene in college and the anti-war movement. That's how I sort of came of age politically. And I think we talked about this a bit last time I was on the podcast. But I didn't want to be one of those people who was outside of the White House like every week with a sign, with some kind of catchy or not catchy slogan, and kind of leave it at that. There is this sense that if we go to protests, if we kind of speak our mind, if we perform our righteousness, then we've done our job and we can go home and then we'll feel good about ourselves. No, people on the left need to be more comfortable with power. They need to be comfortable holding it and wielding it. Otherwise, how are they let's say Bernie Sanders had won in 2020, that would have, I think, been a very good test for the left in forcing them to actually contend with these realities. I hope that someone like Bernie Sanders will win again, but then they're going to have to be in charge of our nuclear arsenal. They're going to have to use military force sometimes. Unfortunately, they're going to have to bomb stuff occasionally. I just don't see, like, at some level, either you're willing to kind of take on the realistic responsibilities of power, or you're not. And if you're not, then you're out of the game. And maybe that is better if you're facing God in the afterlife. But it's not necessarily better, I think, for the rest of the world.
Can I put you guys into conversation or debate with each other? Because, Shadi, what you just ended with is, to me, actually where I wanted to go with the conversation. And I'll start with this. Joey, you brought in Christian ideals, Christian values, which I think is especially interesting right now in a moment we're having a lot of conversations around Christian nationalism. What is the role of Christianity in America? I'm hearing you say that you have a kind of fundamental, foundational discomfort with power, nation state. And I don't want to put words in your mouth. I'm what I'm kind of hearing.
No, go ahead. Make assumptions. I made assumptions.
I think we're all making assumptions, right? And Shadi, what you said, actually, I would push back on in the spirit of getting a debate. Is it really the case that when we die, if we come to God and say, I didn't exercise power, that's better, or is that worse? Because I could, and here's the tension I'm feeling, I could imagine a scenario in which we would be accountable for having power and not using power, right? I think there's probably countless instances from day-to-day life, right? We have money, resources, capacities, abilities that we can share with others to empower them to the level of a nation state. So I guess what I would like to get from both of you is, how does your personal religiosity influence your relationship to power? And Joey, I'll start with you, since I think you made the first assumption.
Yeah. Yeah. So a couple of thoughts there. I think for me, there's a tension here between kind of the realpolitik, what is it really going to take to run a country, versus the morality and the moral structures that I think the person of Christ is trying to put forth. And I don't know. There's not an easy way to synthesize those things. There's just not from me, at least. I do think that Christians like J.D. Vance and other people in the federal government are making moral claims about how to use the government in this moment, and they're making moral claims that I mostly disagree with. And so I think that this is a part of what makes me nervous about kind of combining morality and power, because the ways in which the assumption or the proposal of morality has often been used in really negative ways, actually, in our foreign policy, in our domestic policy. And Shadi, you talk about this in your book, whether it's, trying to instill democracy in Iraq, false pretenses, or even now with what we're seeing in how people are talking about Gaza and Israel. I mean, there's moral claims that people are making when they're kind of pushing forward these different agendas. And so I don't want to remove myself from the political arena. And I hear what you're saying there, Shadi. I also I think I'm pretty uncomfortable with embracing kind of raw power and the implication that imposing my good on other people will somehow, in the end, kind of work out for the betterment of the world.
Well said. That's really well said. So, from my standpoint, maybe this is where the fact that I'm Muslim pushes me to have a little bit of a different position. It's not really for me to kind of say what Christianity is, but I will, whatever how I perceive it. I do think that Christianity has a kind of awkwardness with power. And I think that you're speaking to that, Joey. And that's in part because of the founding of the faith and the fact that Jesus was not a politician in the traditional sense. He did not wield governmental power. He was a rebel against a reigning state. That has major implications for how Christianity develops. It's only several centuries later that Christianity becomes infused in the apparatus of the state. And so those early centuries are very key. That's really like at the heart of any faith is what happens in those early years. And I think our early years are similarly, I think, impactful for what Islam would later become. That Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was a politician, a head of state, a warrior. He was someone who was intimately tied to the exercise of power. And I think that makes us as Muslims maybe less awkward, but we are still awkward just because we've seen like the last 100 years. We have, but I think it's a different kind of awkwardness when it comes to state power. I think Islam is not a good fit for the nation state, and the nation state is not a good fit for Islam. And maybe that was one of the worst things that could have happened to Muslims, really, was the domination of the nation state as the only available option for governance. But we can't undo that. So here we are. And then we see the awkwardness that results when we try to fit Islam into the confines of the nation state. But Harun, to your question about what you're sort of getting at is like, what would God prefer on the day of judgment? I think that's a hard one. I can see it going either way, really. If someone had an opportunity to wield power and could have done good with it, I can imagine, of course, it's all hypothetical. We don't really know how God thinks about these things. I can imagine God being like, hey, you had a chance to improve people's lives and you didn't take that chance. Why did you shrink from those responsibilities? That said, if you're someone who doesn't trust themselves with power because you feel that you're weak, or you feel that your relationship to God isn't strong enough to temper your worst excesses, then maybe it's better for you to sit one out. But that requires a lot of self-awareness. If you really thought that you wouldn't be able to manage power, you'd sort of be a good person. And I think anyway, it's sort of this thing where the people who are most self-aware about the risks of power are actually the good people who we might want to wield power. And then it's sort of the reverse, that other people are unaware of the risks involved, and they're the ones who sort of in their sociopathic way love power and seek it. So it leads to a kind of paradox in that regard. But I think that someone like Mamdani is a really good model here. Someone who actually did not shrink from those responsibilities. But you see how he always has to remind himself and remind the people around him why he's doing this. It does take a certain kind of moral character. And that's what we need. So I guess what I'm calling for is people who they've spent years building that moral character. If they're confident that they've been able to do that well, then I would encourage those people to seek power because they've done the work, so to speak. If you haven't done that work, then maybe you sort of like sit on the bench for a little while.
So Joey, I was going to say, if you want to respond with a kind of broad summary of Islam, you can do that. I feel like if Shadi did with Christianity, you get to do it for Islam.
I think
maybe not diversity, but equity.
Yeah, I largely agree with what Shadi said. I think like my conception of Christianity in a lot of ways was, I'm going to make sure I believe this, I think was spoiled by Constantinianism. Yeah, I think once it was brought into the empire, I think a lot of the thrust of Christianity and the claims of Christ were compromised for the sake of the good of the empire. So, I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense to me. I think also Christianity did develop in this particular context, and it spent 2,000 years making peace with the nation state kind of construct. And so I think it's found its way to operate in the way that we see J.D. Vance doing it, in the way that we've seen, George W. Bush do it. I mean, it's found a way to kind of work itself out. I just wouldn't call it the most faithful kind of representation of what Christ taught or what he represented.
But isn't that what allowed Christianity to spread and become?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so then you kind of have to weigh the good with the bad there. The
Sure.
good is that the gospel was shared with many millions more across
Shadi,
the globe.
Totally. Yeah, preach it. Yeah, I love it. Go for it.
Yeah, so power is necessary to share one's faith with more people.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's something here about what do we believe about the work of God through history and using maybe imperfect means to accomplish the ends that we see as good. I ultimately think I would say that the way of self-sacrifice, the way of the way of self-sacrifice and giving and putting other people in front of yourself is the ultimate means that I want to use for all ends, regardless of whether or not I see them in my maybe weakness, maybe my humility as good. Haroon, you gotta say something, man.
Yeah, I have
He's
a lot of
quiet over
questions.
there.
I feel like this is a great conversation. I didn't expect it to go in this direction, but I'm genuinely enjoying and appreciating these perspectives. I want to take something you said, Shadi. I think the three of us are sophisticated enough to nuance and understand what I'm about to say. But I'm going to preface it with an example because I don't want to be misunderstood. Also, I don't want to inadvertently tank Mamdani's chances in the New York City mayoral election. That would be pretty unfortunate. But
He'll probably have won by the time this comes out.
Inshallah, but just in case, I don't want to. Again, I don't want on the day of judgment to be like, well, suddenly your podcast went viral for all the wrong reasons, and then look at what you did. So, I've seen something. I'm sure you've seen this, Shadi, in Egypt, that a lot of people in Pakistan will behave and act in ways that are deeply affected by religiosity, even if they themselves are not personally religious.
Yeah.
Right. We may not know their level of religiosity. They've just inherited and absorbed a certain set of assumptions and values. So something as simple but foundational as you never let the other person pay for a meal, for example, right? And that kind of back and forth over who's gonna eat, how you treat a guest, things like that are part of the culture. So in that sense, I think that Mamdani is a very religious Muslim. I'm not speaking to his personal religiosity one way or another. I don't know, and frankly, none of my business. But I think that what you were talking about, Shadi, points to his approach to politics, his approach to New York City, the things he talks about, the approach. I feel like there's a level of religiosity embedded in how he pursues what he's doing. And the reason I'm asking that is because you said that there's been this tension between Islam and the nation state. So then I wanted to ask you specifically, what does that mean for American Muslims and America as a concept? Because you're also saying that America as a nation state is the last best hope for humanity, that it is a nation with a moral purpose. Is that, and again, we can have a sophisticated conversation about this, not kind of, we're not sloganeering, obviously, so that's not what I'm looking for. But do you feel like that same tension between Islam and the nation state holds between Islam and the idea of America as a specific kind of nation state?
Yeah, I mean, certainly there are tensions there. I will just say that the point you make on Mamdani is really interesting. I think there is something quite Islamic about him and his politics, even though we don't know really his religiosity. And that actually tells us something important, that there's a way to be religious that's sort of separate from the outward markers of religiosity. And you can just see it in the way he comports himself, that he's imbued with a moral sensibility, and we should all aspire to that. So that's what I mean when I say there's something Islamic about his politics. It doesn't have to have anything to do with Islamic law or supposedly his desire to turn New York City into, a Sharia state or whatever. But, oh boy, oh yeah, the nation state. Yeah, it's coming back to me. Okay, so... Well, first of all, the U.S. example is a little bit different because we're not a majority here. So I think the fact that we're only about 1% of the population means that we have a fundamentally different relationship to this state than we would if we were 90% of the population. If we were 90% of the population, let's admit it, there would probably be a significant number of Muslims who would want Islam or even Islamic law to play a role in public life. Granted, it would probably be a little bit different in the American case, because let's say America became 90% Muslim in 400 years. By that time, American Muslims would have been so imbued with liberalism and liberal ideas that maybe we would have secularized to the extent where we wouldn't want Islam to play too much of a role in public life. Or if we did, it wouldn't be in the traditional way, in a kind of legalistic sense. It would be in a more kind of vague moral sense. Anyway, that's all just like interesting things to ponder. I think that there's something so unique about the American Muslim experience insofar as this is the best place, in my view, to be a Muslim in the world today. Now, it's a very low bar, of course. So we have to qualify it with that. The other thing that I would qualify is, I don't know if I have said before that that America is the last best hope. I don't know how literally I mean that, because I don't know what the world is going to look like in 200 years. When I say last best hope, I'm thinking more about our lifetimes, because that's the only thing that really I'm going to be able to, well, inshallah, I'd have an impact on certain things after my lifetime if people still read my stuff, but we don't really know how that's going to work out. What I have more control over is how I can present myself and my ideas while I'm alive. And that's the period where I think America is the last best hope. That's what we have to focus on. There is a possibility that in 100 to 200 years, there could be some Muslim entity in the Middle East, or more broadly, that would play a leadership role in the world and would be inspiring and would be somewhat democratic. And maybe it would be a caliphate of some sort, but a nice, friendly, positive, constructive caliphate.
Yeah, no Constantine here, Joey. Just
And look, I think in that case, there's a strong Muslim objection to my book that I am prioritizing a non-Muslim entity, America, over alternative futures in which Muslims can have more of a say. And I imagine that, that's actually a debate I'm willing to have. It's an interesting one. But I don't think it's really germane to our current context, again, for the simple reason that there is no prospect of that Muslim thing, caliphate-like entity emerging in our lifetimes. So we have to work with what we've got. And this is me speaking to other Muslims who are less secular, more Islamist or more Islamically minded. They're going to be very skeptical of my premises, but I'll just remind them, there is no alternative for the time being.
So if we take it away from there and we go back to the American Muslim community, and I want to ask both of you then, if there is this moral mission in the U.S., that this is part of our self-conception as Americans, that we are building a country and constantly building a country that aspires to something that we will never fully realize, but we're always attempting to approach, a more perfect union.
Like an asymptote, a mathematical asymptote.
Exactly. That's a beautiful way of putting it. In that sense, then, in this moment, who do you think embodies that, if anyone? Are there people that you look to, whether that's religious leaders, cultural figures, politicians, who you would say that individual is pointing in the right direction or moving us in a direction that is true to who we are meant to be as Americans?
Interesting. Yeah, I would put Mamdani up there.
I would socialist, Shadi.
Well, I mean, I'm open
just putting you on the spot.
No, I mean, I'm not, but I'm open to some. I mean, I'm not like totally opposed to free things if there's a way to pay for them, which is itself a little bit of a paradox because it's not free if you have to pay for them. But like,
Joey, can we just take that I'm not opposed to free things and just turn it into a clip and we can loop it?
That'd be good.
So that's actually a good question for me to follow up with is, when you mentioned him, you mentioned something he stands for, right? Like his relationship to New York City, what he wants to see for New York. So what specifically do you think he represents about America that inspires you or maybe reassures you in this moment?
I can see that he just loves this country so much. And New York City is obviously part of that. but the way he treats his fellow citizens, the fact that he seems so open-hearted towards them, you notice that he's always smiling. He's always comporting himself in a very respectful way. He just has a kind of, there's a sense of how you present yourself in public in a way that is fair, respectful, that is cognizant of other people's perspectives without necessarily just giving into their perspective. So he's not like pandering. He's saying, listen, we might disagree, but I'm going to listen to what you have to say because you're a fellow New Yorker, you're a fellow American, and we all have a say. So I think that kind of sensibility is the one that I'd love to see more in our politics. Another one of my favorite politicians is John Ossoff, the Democratic senator, who I think models some of that as well. I mean, there are a few. They're not, I wouldn't say that they're the most prominent people. I think, again, that goes to the kind of inverse relationship between morality and how successful you are. If you're very successful in American politics, it can often mean that you're a bad person or a sociopath. And that's just the way it is, but we have to fight that. And like Bernie Sanders is actually another counter to that. Again, he wasn't able to wield power maybe in the way that we hope, but he has an incredible level of prominence in the public debate. So he actually shows that you can hold on to your principles and still be a prominent, successful politician, inspiring tens of millions of people across the country. And again, Bernie doesn't compromise on his moral core. You can see that with people. Like, do they have a moral core or not? For me, that is the fundamental question. And it's sort of like porn. You know it when you see it, right? You know when someone has a moral core.
Yeah, that's fascinating. The one question that keeps coming up for me is, I know you talked in the previous interview that we had with you about this book that you were working on, and you've been working on this book kind of before the re-election of Trump, and then published it kind of in this moment. And I would love to hear you talk just a little bit about how has the purpose of the book shifted in this moment compared to with when you initially kind of imagined what the book was going to be.
Yeah, well, I wrote a big chunk of it pre-October 7th. And then October 7th, I took a break from the book because I didn't really know what to do with it and how much Gaza would or should play a role in my own thinking. So I had to let that sit, and I had to kind of linger with some of those tensions in my own thinking. And Gaza, for me, you know, as we talked about in the last podcast I was on, was you know, it sort of presented itself as the fundamental moral quandary of our time. It is the moral crisis for people of our generation, but also of people of really any generation, as long as they're sort of sentient now. I think this will be it for them. I mean, I hope there isn't something quite as bad that happens in the coming, you know, in the coming years or decades. But I think that for me, this book is in part a reckoning over Gaza. It's a test for me. The question I posed to myself was, could I still believe in America in the way that I wanted to believe in it after Gaza? Was it still possible for me to make these arguments to people? Or would I have to kind of withdraw a little bit from the public arena and say, oh crap, I can't do this anymore. I can't make a case for America. I don't feel comfortable telling young progressives or Arabs or Muslims to believe in the country that is facilitating a genocide. But then the conclusion that I reached in my own thinking was that there was nothing intrinsic about American power that required us to facilitate a genocide. That was historically contingent. It could have been otherwise. And at some level, we get the government we deserve and we get the foreign policy we deserve. So the fact that our country played this role in Gaza was a function of the fact that pro-Palestine voices, people who understood the Palestinian cause and the Palestinian quandary, they were not able to exercise power in the public arena the way that pro-Israel voices were. But that's something that can change over time. And I have hope about that. And we already see that hope playing out in the fact that half of Democratic senators, you know, called for a suspension of military sales to Israel. That would have been unthinkable 10 years ago. Or the fact that more than 75% of Democrats disapprove of Israel's war in Gaza. Or the fact that now, for the first time, more Americans are sympathetic towards the Palestinians over the Israelis for the first time in history this past year in recent polling. So all of that suggests to me that if the war in Gaza happened 10 years from now instead of 2 years ago, we might have seen a different American role. So when people say America did this, yes, it did this. I'm not contesting that. But what I am saying is that if we're thinking about American power, conceptually, American power is not intrinsically bad. It changes how we use it is really a function of how we use it. That part is up to us, in other words.
So in other words, in the event of a future event like Gaza, instead of America removing itself from that conversation, it's using the power that it has to condition military aid to Israel based upon human rights, or it's something like that. It's trying to leverage the power in the future in a different way than it did in this past example.
Yes, exactly. And I should say that too, that I'm not someone who believes that the U.S. will ever cut Israel off entirely. So people might say, well, Shadi, you're just talking about conditioning military aid on better behavior. Here, we just have to be realistic. I don't envision a scenario, at least in the foreseeable future, where the U.S. is going to say, Israel, you're not even an ally. You guys are done. Forget about it. We're not doing anything with you. And this is where there has to be some kind of concession to reality. The only realistic option is a two-state solution. The U.S. is never going to support some like wonderful multi-ethnic binational state. And Israel will probably still be an ally. The question is, what kind of friend will we be to Israel? Will we be the friend who just gives them the keys to the car and says, crash the car every single day if you want? Or will we say, hey, we're the ones giving you the car. We're going to take away the keys if you don't know how to drive. And that might fall well short of people's expectations of what they would want America to do. But that, I want to also be realistic, and I'm someone who tries to live in reality to the extent possible. I think the alternative to what, and Joey, you sort of touched on this when you said in that future conflict, the other option would be for America to remove itself from the conversation entirely. This is the fantasy that's, I think, some people have, is that America would just stop playing a big role in the Middle East. We would just focus on our own internal affairs, and we'll kind of leave that for other people to deal with. But honestly, if we left Israel to its own devices, that's still going to be pretty frightening. If we have leverage with Israel, we should use it. Because Israel unbound, Israel without any kind of tie to the outside world, Israel as a kind of garrison pariah state that just does whatever it feels like without any care to what other countries think, that would probably be even worse than what we saw during the Gaza war, if that's even imaginable. Honestly, I think there's a lot of Israeli leaders who, in their ideal world, they would just drop a nuclear bomb on Gaza and the West Bank and just, I don't know, obviously that wouldn't work because then that would affect Israel as well. But let's say hypothetically they found a way to just pinpoint it to only kill Palestinians. I think that in their heart of hearts, a lot of them would actually prefer that. Like, let's just real talk here, So I think in some ways, even the crazy Israel that we're seeing now that is doing a genocide is actually somewhat more constrained than what Israelis might want in their ideal world.
So the point you're making, a lot of us, I feel, realized that, yourself included, very early on in this war, that there was clearly an eliminationist intent. It might not have looked like the kind of eliminationist wars we've been used to historically, unfortunately, in recent decades, but if you put all the evidence together, clearly there was indiscriminate killing, clearly that was intentional, and there was a desire to expel, remove, or otherwise destroy certain populations. And I think eventually most of the world has come to that conclusion at different speeds. But the effect that had on a lot of us as Americans, we're still grappling with, I feel. So my own conception of America, American politics has changed tremendously. I didn't just ask you the question about socialism just to throw in a kind of fun side point, but to ask how you've changed. And the reason I'm saying that is you said, and you have a chapter in the book on hypocrisy. You talked about that kind of asymptotic effect between the values we aspire to and our ability to realize them. I know a number of colleagues, friends, people who are serious folks who follow the news closely, who are well informed, who have taken from the last 2 years a very different lesson. They've not taken the lesson of hypocrisy. They've not taken that here is a place where America fell short, or maybe more precisely where liberalism fell short. That this is actually revealing what has always been the case. And it's not the case that words fail to live up to actions. It's that words are actually used to distract from actions, that there is intentionality, and the intentionality is morally ugly. That it's the same way that powerful companies would make a whole show of diversity and embracing difference, and the minute there was a shift in administration, they ran the other way because there was no conviction behind that. There was no seriousness behind that. They were just doing whatever they needed to do to make money. And if the winds went this way, they went that way. If the winds went this way, they went that way. And so what would you say to those people? What do you think your book would say to people who say, no, what we saw in Gaza was not a betrayal of America, but a revelation of who, and I won't go so far as to say who America is. I think that's a kind of absurd point and an impossible point anyway, but who a lot of people in power are, including Democrats who would talk all the time about Islamophobia, about racism, about inclusion, about diversity. When this was in front of us, a lot of the people who presumably would have been concerned were happy to speed it along.
But again, I'm still struggling with this question of when we say it reveals some kind of fundamental truth about America, what we have to be specific about what that fundamental truth would be. When I think about the fundamental truth of America, I think about our founding documents. I think about the Declaration. I think about the Bill of Rights and the Constitution. And those speak to our enduring values. That is who we are. Now, people can make an argument, a kind of 1619 argument, and say that actually the true America is the America of slavery, and that's a different kind of debate. I don't agree with that perspective. And even if that perspective were in some sense true, I think it would be better for people not to believe in it, because if you really believed that America was fundamentally evil, it would completely suck away your ability to constructively participate in society. If you came to the conclusion that America was irrevocably bad and beyond redemption, then what's the point of even doing any of this? We just sit at home and just cry to ourselves. So I think that it's better to believe in our better angels, even if the story is a little bit more complicated. As for Gaza, I actually don't think Gaza was an example of hypocrisy, because we stopped even pretending. The mask came off entirely. Usually when we do bad things, we pretend that we're doing good things. Here we weren't even pretending. Joe Biden couldn't even be bothered to express barely any sympathy towards Palestinians. Pretty much the administration's position was war is ugly. Sorry, guys. So I think that was actually an abdication of our traditional hypocrisy. I would have liked us to be more hypocritical than we were, because then at least there would have been a reminder of what we were aspiring to. We gave up on that entirely. That's what was so frightening about it. It is really frightening when the mask comes off entirely. And that's what we saw in Gaza. And that's why I think it's the moral crisis of our time. But when we're talking about previous bad episodes in American history, at least the more recent ones like the Iraq War, I don't think George W. Bush woke up in the morning thinking to himself, I want to kill Iraqis. I actually think and based on what he himself has said and and interviews that I've done with people who were with him in the room at key decision points, I'm willing to acknowledge that George W. Bush thought that what he was doing was ultimately going to be good for Iraqis. That doesn't justify the war, but it speaks to a moral impulse that was still there even in our worst episodes. I think there was a genuine desire to improve Afghanistan. How that played out in practice didn't work out great. We know that. But I think we have to also acknowledge that the U.S., like, I mean, and I do mention in the book a couple instances during the first Arab Spring, which is often forgotten, which happened around 2004, 2005. George W. Bush had something called the Freedom Agenda. George W. Bush spoke very eloquently about how Arabs deserved the human rights and freedom that everyone else deserved. And you might say that's a really low bar. Of course, it's universal. But actually, we've had U.S. presidents who don't believe that Arabs are deserving of the same rights. Barack Obama was notoriously bad on this. He would talk about Arabs as like being tribal, about how they had to get their act together, and how they were kind of prone to overly religious thinking and they had to kind of go through some kind of reformation. He would talk about Islam and Muslims and Arabs in this very weird neo-colonial way. George W. Bush did not do that. He was a believer that we were equal. So I just want to put that there as the Iraq War and how we look at it, I think is an important, it's an important piece of this overall story. And I have a more nuanced view about what it really meant in the end.
I have a big question, Harun. You want to you want to have a follow up?
No, go ahead.
Okay. For me, I think a big part of a moral framework or consciousness is about projecting a different possibility. I think I would call this something like a prophetic imagination. It seems like a lot of what you're talking about and writing about is, but let's be realistic here. But let's be real about what's actually possible. I would love to hear you talk about how you kind of synthesize or make sense of that tension. I know, like, as we talk about foreign policy, it may take on like a little bit different shade or veneer, but how do you make sense of that? When have you been too realistic to kind of forego some potential aspects of what it would look like to realize a moral consciousness that you're trying to work for?
Well, look, we live in a world that is tragic. And the question is, how do we operate in a world where tragedy is part of what it means to be human? And what does it mean to live and be in the world when we are, to use a kind of Christian framework, when we're kind of fallen and we're broken by sin? And so I am sympathetic to this kind of Christian notion of inherent imperfection in this world. I think Muslims have their own kind of version of it too, a very practical approach to policy making, and we have ways to be almost like too practical sometimes. And, you know, different caliphs were able to use different justifications in their executive authority to do things that were against or at least questionably in line with the Sharia. So I think that religious traditions actually have a lot to offer when it comes to the question of the tragic. And that's why I think Islam and Christianity were so successful, is because they were able to be in the world as it was. There was an aspirational aspect of wanting to be better than we could ever hope to be, but there was also a sense of coming to terms with reality. There's always a tension there. The way that I try to delineate is I try to make my own judgment about what is even like what is remotely plausible. Like, what is something. This is always a challenge with idealism because people can disagree on what is possible when we're talking about the art of the possible, right? So the way that I delineate on Israel and Gaza is I've made a determination that there is no plausible scenario for the coming decade or two at least for us to cut off ties entirely with Israel. I just don't see any plausible path to getting to that outcome. That's a judgment that I made. People can disagree with that, but if they disagree with it, they have to make the argument on the terms of the argument itself. They would have to offer a plausible path that we can get our heads around. If they can't, then they can't. So that's kind of how I do it. I take a certain issue and I'm like, is there a plausible path to the outcome or not in the next 10 to 20 years?
Has there been kind of like, has there been a marginal case for you where you're like, I'm not exactly sure if this is possible or not, but guided by my moral view of the universe, I actually am going to try to kind of shift the window of possibility so that something that maybe doesn't immediately seem possible could actually become possible.
Huh. That's interesting. That's interesting wording that you used. I wonder if I've said something like that before. No, I'm actually, that sounds, it sounds like something I've thought before. Yeah, the impossible becoming possible. I think the Arab Spring showed us a little bit of that. 2 months before the Arab Spring started, there wasn't a single academic specializing on the Middle East who predicted that Tunisia would be the first to fall.
Yeah.
It's just like no one saw that coming. So I totally take the point that, we have to allow for some unpredictability. So, I take that point. But I think there are things that we have control over versus things that we don't. Tunisia was a case where the U.S. wasn't very involved. And ultimately what Tunisians chose to do internally was going to be the primary factor. I think when it comes to something like America's relationship to Israel, we actually understand the forces involved a little bit more. And so I think it's just one of those things where, I don't know, like people can disagree with me. I wish I had a better answer. I'm actually trying to come up with a better answer right now, but it is really hard to adjudicate on this point. There are probably, please.
No, I was just going to say, obviously this is a tension that exists. Obviously, I think the way we started the conversation was something about how do our religious convictions inform this conversation. And, something like the Arab Spring in the moment it almost felt miraculous. Like, what is happening in this moment? Like, and I think, as people of faith, one of the things that we're trying to do is not just to work with the real of what we're looking at. It's to say there is another possibility. And I just don't want to lose sight of that, because there's a way for us to say, to compromise our moral claims or moral possibilities, because we're so consumed with a realistic description of the context that we're working in.
But this is where we play different roles. So I totally take your point that people who have that more prophetic role, they should be saying and laying out alternatives that have no realistic chance of happening, because that is their role in society. The role that I'm playing is not that. I just have a different story in my life. I'm in a different position. I've been in mainstream institutions for most of my life. I worked at a think tank for 14 years where the job was to try to influence policymakers to be less bad. It wasn't about putting out a prophetic call for action. That's never been my role.
That would have been a great final report, though, if you had
published
that on your way out the door, just posted it to the website.
Exactly, yeah. So, I mean, we coexist together. I want the prophetic person to be there because they're shifting the Overton window. The more you have people saying we need a one-state solution in Israel-Palestine, the more it makes me seem moderate. Then people can be like, oh, those people are crazy. Shadi's the reasonable one, even though he's still saying very controversial things. So there's always a role, a kind of strategic and tactical role for different kinds of people to kind of work off of each other, even though they're advocating for different things. It's all in the service of the same overall set of objectives. And so I've just decided that I'm going to play a different kind of role because I have a different audience and different sorts of people listen to me. And I feel more comfortable playing the role that I'm playing. And I think that it's also maybe a more unique role. I think that there's a lot of people of faith who are doing the prophetic work. Sorry, I don't want to make the prophetic call, whatever you want to call that. And I can do something a little bit different because I've been in this in-between space for a long time.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. I have an idea here, Haroon, but shut me down if you don't want to go this direction, okay?
No, go ahead.
So one of the conversations that I really appreciated that you all had was in the lead up to the last election where Shadi, you decided that you were going to vote for Kamala, and Haroon said, absolutely, I can't do that. And you had this conversation on Wisdom of Crowds. Yeah. I wonder, is that an example of the prophetic versus the real?
It's an example of where I was right. Let's just be honest here. Let's just do real talk. You know.
Wait. So you're saying that we should vote for the candidate who you described as, it was like 10 minutes ago, the mask came off. There was not even a pretense of hypocrisy.
Yeah, that's me being. Yes, I mean, look. I don't want to like relitigate this particular case. But I do think, considering how bad Trump has been, Trump 2.0, it's been horrifying in so many ways, and it's affected people on so many levels, and it's destroyed people's lives. It's destroyed families when it comes to ICE raids and people being deported and so forth. If we could have just prevented those worst excesses by having Kamala in office, oh boy, I just long for that. Thinking about that alternative history, it almost seems like paradise just compared to what we have right now. And if more people could have realized that and voted accordingly, oh boy, I would have taken that in a second. I really feel strongly about that. That's not to say that I think Haroon was playing more of the prophetic role there. But if we're talking about what was the better outcome for the country, and what we were saying wasn't going to change the election, but let's say Haroon was like Joe Rogan and he could actually tip an election one way or the other, I think that Haroon would have been well served to actually make the case for people holding their noses and voting for Kamala, because when it actually matters what you're saying and you can actually sway enough people's votes, it just would have been, we would have lived better lives. It's really that simple. And I think the Islamic call, in part, is to reduce harm. So even if harm is at very high levels, just to go a little bit lower than the really bad, to just bad. This is where maybe I'm a little bit fatalistic. I just don't, I'm idealistic in some ways, but in other ways I'm just like, hey guys, let's just do less bad.
Haroon, you got to say something, man.
I love how Haroon's just sitting there silently.
So I think Islamically it was wrong to vote for her. Because
I know
it was wrong to vote for her, because I think that what I get from religion, and this is, I think, this is a debate we're going to have, inshallah, in the afterlife as well. We can continue the conversation for years to come. Hopefully we won't be there too soon, but and I'll explain why that is. Because to me, there's certain things you simply cannot vote for, even if it's a means to an apparently better end. That there are certain religious red lines that are just taboo. And when I know that there are a set of politicians who are openly complicit in the massacre of women and children, of innocent people, who, as to your point exactly, make no pretense about it, don't even attempt to justify it, don't seek within the many means available to them to reduce that harm, then we are ourselves becoming complicit in that crime. And I think the reason I'm saying this is, I'll say two things. One is, I think there's a tendency for a lot of us who are of a certain age to think that the present moment is an aberration, and that if only Kamala Harris had come in, we could have reversed course or fixed things or slowed things down. Whereas I think this is something, the moment we're in is the product of years and years and years of political degeneration. I'm reminded constantly every day of a hadith of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, that seems to speak directly to this moment, in which he says, if you feel no shame, do whatever you like. Meaning that when a society has lost any sense of public morality, it begins to cave in on itself. That its moral scaffolding is so broken that suddenly things that even a year or two ago would have been unimaginable are now commended and applauded. And I think that applies on both sides. I don't think that's exclusive to right or left. And so the work of fixing it is work that can only proceed if it is resting on certain moral absolutes, which include, we don't kill innocent people. I cannot, as a matter of conscience, go from here to there. Because to me, it was a choice between two really bad ways of being in the world. that everything that Trump is doing is really harmful. I don't doubt that. But I also think that if she had been elected, that we probably would have seen an even more brutal genocide. And so what we're being asked, I don't think she would have ever stepped in to stop it. I think that if the war with Iran had started, I think she probably would have there was no evidence prior to the election that there were any red lines. And so if the war between Iran and Israel had started, I think Trump actually, and again, I'm not a fan of Trump in this instance because he was still supporting the war on Gaza, but he did say to Netanyahu, this needs to stop, right? Like, you need to dial it down for whatever reasons he had. I don't think a Harris or a Biden administration would have done that. I think they would have just brought the full force of the American military into it, and we would have seen an attempt at regime change. And then the question becomes, where do we draw that line? And I don't know that there's an easy answer to it, but I'll end on two miraculous notes that I think speak to this moment as I see it, right? I was in New York 2 weeks ago, and I was there for work, and I hadn't been back to New York in many years. So it was a weird sort of feeling to be back in a city that had done so much to shape me. And I landed in LaGuardia. The fact that there's a new LaGuardia airport is itself miraculous.
Yeah.
I had convinced myself that New York would just continue to fall apart, and it would just break down. And part of the reason I left was I kind of felt that this place is this. I don't see a better future for New York. But the second thought that occurred to me after taking in this brand new, shiny, clean, functioning airport was, wow, I could come back in a month and the mayor of this city could be a Muslim. And that was surreal to imagine that the most significant city in the Western world, arguably the most important city in the world still, or at least one of the most important cities, has as its leading candidate a Muslim mayor. And I think what ultimately actually surprised me about this moment, and this is where I will admit, Shadi, that I still have questions about the vote in the election, is not my choice. I'm still comfortable with that. I wrestled with that for months and months and months, and I made the decision knowing full well what could happen if she lost, because I still felt it was just two really, really bad choices. The thing that shocked me was the fact that so many leading Democrats just caved. I didn't think they would fight for Arabs and Muslims. There's clearly a double standard there. There's a deep, even violent racism. But I thought that they would stand up for our country. And they didn't. And what I take from that is actually more evidence of the moral rot. That when there was a moment when their patriotism was on the line, from big law firms to leading institutional figures, they just walked away. And I actually think if more people had the kind of courage to say, I'm not going to cross certain lines, even if it means leading to outcomes I don't like I'm going to hold here, I think we'd be in a better place. I actually think that if more people had the ability to say, I'm not making instrumental decisions. I'm not making, and I'm not saying what you're saying is instrumental in a bad way, right? I see what you're saying, that that humanity is flawed and that we're trying to bring about the kind of least bad or less bad option, right? I don't think that your opinion is wrong religiously or morally by any means.
Yes.
I'm just explaining why I feel the way I feel, and I couldn't kind of cross that bridge. But I also think that if more Democrats couldn't cross a bridge, whatever the bridge was of their choosing, we'd be in a better place. Like if we didn't have the Chuck Schumers and the Hakeem Jeffries, if we had more Bernie Sanderses, if you will, I don't know what the plural is, but if we had more Bernie Sanderses, if we had more Mamdanis, if we had more Ossoffs, we would be in a better place. And we don't, and now it's on us, or I suppose it's on you, because you have to come up with the realistic proposals. But yeah, that's my answer. Sorry, Joey, you put us in this terrible position.
That was really well said. I'm glad that you laid that out. That was actually kind of rousing. I mean, we disagree, but I appreciate where you're coming from.
Likewise.
Yeah.
My question, and then Joey, I'll go to this because I really want to hear this from you, Shadi. I think it was Dwight Eisenhower who said every American should have a religion. I don't care which one it is. There was something to the effect that he once said. And what I love about this book and your public scholarship is that I can follow threads in your thinking that connect across years. And one of them that I think is really interesting is the case for American power, this idea that America can and therefore should do good in the world, and that we have a belief that we have a responsibility not just to ourselves but to the wider world, seems to me to be premised on the ability of individuals and communities to have an internal moral compass.
Yeah.
And whether that's religion and ethical tradition, obviously I have my own opinion here, but I want to hear from you. Where do you think religion fits into the argument that you're making about the case for American power?
You can't understand morality without religion. And it's no mistake that almost every single president, to our knowledge, up until Donald Trump, was, or at least maybe not particularly religious, but at least subscribed to a faith and were comfortable at some level talking about that faith publicly. Even someone like Dwight Eisenhower, who kind of framed it in more secular terms, that, hey, this is just a good thing for people. This is just a good thing for people. Donald Trump changed that as the first non-Christian president that I think we've had, actually. Obviously, besides Barack Obama, but that's obvious, So, no, I'm joking. For people who don't know, that's a joke. That's just a joke Muslims make. That
They're
Barack
going
Obama.
to hear the neo-colonial thing with this and get very confused.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that it's not a mistake that we've lost our moral language at precisely the same time that we had a president, Donald Trump, who doesn't claim to be religious or doesn't even really claim to be a professed Christian. So, yeah, I think that what we're seeing now is the danger of the post-religious right. And I think Ross Douthat had that really memorable line a few years ago. If you didn't like the religious right, wait until you see the post-religious right. And I think he was right about that. So I think religion gives us a kind of moral energy, even for people who themselves are not that religious. It gives us a kind of North Star. And it gives us a common language that we can all fall back on as Americans. If we know that religion is part of our public sphere, whether it's the kind of general God talk or more specifically Christian forms of that, it gives us that common language. I think really matters, because some of the language that previous presidents have used about our moral mission, they have drawn on religious ideas, like the city on the hill, which was first put forward by the Puritan leader John Winthrop in the 17th century. So I think that we really lose something when we don't have that moral language, and religion is still the primary source of that moral language.
Okay, here's the closer. You ready for this?
Okay, bring it on.
Right. If you could speak to a person right now who's feeling alienated from their country, from their religion, and you want to give them a hopeful message about purpose, the use of power, how would you frame it to that person?
Yeah. I would say, look, this is not the end. There's still a lot that is uncertain. We have elections that are coming up. We don't know who's going to win. There's actually a lot of uncertainty about our politics going forward. The 2030s could look wildly different than the 2020s. We really just don't know. And one of the positive things about Donald Trump, he's opened up our politics where things that were previously not possible become possible. To kind of riff off of what Joey had said earlier. Because he breaks all the established structures. He breaks all the established patterns of thinking, and he says, it's open. Now you can say radical, anyone can say radical things, and they're probably not going to be canceled. Actually, that's not completely true. If you say pro-Palestine things, then you might be canceled. But there are certain ideas that you can say now that you probably wouldn't have felt comfortable saying 10 years ago. So there's a sense that politics is very fluid. So I think people should just remember that just because things seem hopeless now in 2025 doesn't mean they're going to be hopeless in 2026 or 2028. People have to be patient. And they got to play the long game here. And they also have to focus a little bit more on their own local communities, that it's not for everyone to focus on national politics. Haroon and I do, because that's what we signed up for. We're authors who write about the world around us. But if you're not in that kind of profession, then you can find real ways to enjoy life with the people you care about at the community level and try to improve things there. You don't have to worry about New York City or the entire country. You can focus on your 10,000 person town. I don't know. I guess we still have 10,000 person towns in different parts of the country. Or even your neighborhood if you live in a city. There's other ways to engage in politics besides like the Trump stuff. I think people have nationalized our politics so much that they've forgotten that there is the local. There are races that don't have Democratic candidates because people just aren't interested in local politics. If you really wanted to, you could run for like whatever it is, dog catcher or something, and like you'll run an uncontested race and you'll win. So I think people forget that politics isn't this one thing. It's actually a very complex kind of patchwork of different things all together. And I'd also say people should always remember it could be worse. However bad things are, they could be worse. And, you know, there's that famous Quranic verse, don't dislike or hate a thing. It may be better for you. You may not realize it. I mean, I'm just riffing off the verse now. Like, you may not realize that something that seemed really bad in the moment was ultimately pushing you on a different path that was going to be good for you. God works in mysterious ways. We don't know his plan. So I think that that's always a good thing to remember. It's always this is not a Quranic verse, but I guess it's a similar idea. It's always darkest before the dawn. You know, that's kind of how these things tend to work. Yeah, it kind of just end with that. It's always darkest before the dawn. But, you know, it's actually funny. I think someone also said like a riff on that. It's always darkest and then it becomes pitch black. So if you really want to go dark, like that would be the alternative. But we don't want to think about the pitch black.
Thanks for listening, and thanks to Zach Swellbar for recording our theme music. If you enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to like and subscribe, and let us know what questions we should be asking and who else we should be talking to.